Boom. We are live streaming, my friend. How are you?
Nice. I'm doing well, doing really well. Thank you for having me on.
It's a pleasure, man. So we connected on Twitter recently, and you hit me up and told me that you would like to discuss Bitcoin and scarcity, two
Yeah,
subjects that I'm very interested in and interested to hear your thoughts on. So I'm going to get you. Why don't you introduce yourself first, and then we'll break right into it.
yeah, absolutely. So my name's Reed. I currently work for Swan Bitcoin as their customer support. And I'm actually relatively new to the space. So I got really, really into Bitcoin in probably winter 2018 or sorry, winter 2019. So started getting in it
Oh shit.
in the fall there, right as prices were crashing. Um, so one of the unusual folks who became more interested at the very bottom. Um, yeah, and then I've just been reading nonstop. It sucked me in, and I had, while I was getting into it, I was lucky that I had this sweet job that was 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off. So I'd be in the woods with kids doing wilderness therapy for 2 weeks, then like writing raps about Bitcoin with them, and then come out of the woods and just like be reading Rothbard straight for 2 weeks, and then go
Amazing.
back in the woods again.
Amazing. It's
So I had
funny
a
how
lot
your
of
life it's funny how your life circumstances like provides the parameters for how you can learn about things, especially
oh
when you're
yeah,
super enthralled by them. Because one of
yeah,
the things with Bitcoin is that some people just don't have the time to read like
yeah.
all the things required to fully appreciate it. But
Mhm.
anyway, sorry to interrupt. Go on.
No, no, that's a good point. Cause I'm reaching out to all my friends now about it, and they're just so slammed with their own work.
Yeah.
Heads down about either in med school or like in their own startup or even on Wall Street, and they just like can't. I send them like a 10-minute article, and they're like, "Oh, I don't have time for that."
Yeah, and you get home,
Uh,
you just want to chill, right? At the end of the day,
yeah,
you don't want to go back into, you know,
exactly.
until you get hooked by it, you don't know.
Yeah.
Like now, I don't consider it work. I just enjoy reading about it and
Mm,
learning about it and stuff. But until that shifts for you, it's just like more time doing something other than unwinding, relaxing, chilling.
exactly, exactly. So that's why I really appreciated that job I had over last summer and last fall because I could just be 2 weeks, 2 weeks reading, and then 2 weeks sort of like testing these ideas out, trying to talk to. I mean, I was supposed to be helping them with their like emotional learning. And I, clearly was doing that, but I was also sort of like, testing sound money out on them.
How old are they?
It was the oldest kids I worked with. They're not even kids. It was like 18 to 24. So it was all,
Oh, okay.
yeah. So
They could have some valuable insights if you if
oh,
you you know
definitely,
probe them
definitely.
properly.
It was all kids that had been sort of overparented a little bit, and then were trying to take their first steps into like independence, and it's sort of fallen on their face somehow. And so they like came to our program, and um, yeah, and I was just talking to them about money and independence and Bitcoin.
That's awesome. What was their like reaction or response to that?
I mean, we were in the woods, so in a lot of ways, it was hard to like,
It's kind of
you
the
know,
antithesis.
yeah, hard to really connect with them about or see the point of this like crazy technology that they couldn't access because they didn't have their phones, their computers.
But this is interesting, right? Because Bitcoin is such a generational thing in many ways. I mean, not exclusively. It crosses generations, of course, but obviously it skews younger in terms of how people think about digital landscapes and worlds, and
Mm,
just
yep.
and I'm curious, like what that demographic, uh, like when you tell them about Bitcoin, are they immediately receptive? Are they resistant? Are they apathetic? Like, what is the kind of nature of like the most common response you get when you would talk to these kids about this kind of stuff?
Yeah, that's a good question. It does skew young. I mean, like as a side note, just was looking at sort of like engagement on the Swan Bitcoin Twitter account, and I think the highest demographic is males 25 to 34.
Yeah.
That's like that is who engages with us. But when I was working with those kids and getting into Bitcoin at the same time, a lot of them actually came to us because they had sort of video game addictions. That was for whatever reason the program I worked with that was one of their specialties. And so with those kids, it was actually a lot easier because their lives were already in like a digital. They like cared enormously about
Yeah, it's
something.
right up their alley for sure.
But a lot of them had this, the main thing they were working through was like realizing that they wanted to do something more with their life, and that there was like more purpose in their life than with becoming a really high level wizard or something, or live streaming Fortnite all the time.
Right.
So that was actually those are cool conversations to have. Is like trying to get kids, really young adults, to think about like what it is in life that they really want, and then go pursue those. And that gelled a lot better, or that gelled pretty well with Bitcoin.
Yeah. Well, there's so many angles you could take on it, right? I'm just imagining now you or me or any other Bitcoiner sitting around a campfire, like out in the wilderness, just like telling these young minds about Bitcoin and making it relevant for their specific, situation and circumstance, and just having them be like, oh yeah. And like, you or me would be so passionately into it, and like the wise old dude telling them about sound money and Bitcoin and shit.
Yeah, I mean, I think or the young adult that I connected better with was a bit of a musician, and he was really good at piano, and we had a piano in one of the main camps actually. So when we would like come back from trips, we could play a little bit. So we'd go out on trip and write the lyrics. Me and him would write lyrics to like Bitcoin songs, then come back and he would like chord it out on the piano. And I think for him it was more like, I was slowly sprinkling in sound money stuff, but for him it was just like connecting with an adult on something, and like realizing that creative energy is beautiful and awesome, and like he was really gifted at piano, so just like encouraging him to pursue that.
Did the organizers or managers or owners or whatever the structure was, did they take any issue with you talking to the kids about like magic internet money or what?
I mean, like when bosses were around, it was all about emotional stuff. It's like emotions and like independence and how's the relationship with your parents, and then when we're out on trail.
All right, fuck that shit. Let's talk about Bitcoin.
Yeah, exactly. It's like me and this kid in the back rapping about Bitcoin as we walk down the trail. Like nobody knew about that, right? Like we drop back, rap about Bitcoin, catch up with the
the irony, the ironic part about that is, and I've talked about this a bunch on the podcast, and I generally mean it at this point. Like I started off saying it kind of as a joke, and I won't get into it too far here, but just the fact that coming to understand, learn about, and engage with Bitcoin has added such a huge amount of meaning and happiness and like hopefulness to people's lives, the way they see the future, the way they see themselves, that like that should be included in any form of counseling, psychotherapy, like mentorship, because like you might think it's unrelated, but the facts are the facts. Like learning about sound money and what Bitcoin represents and what it could mean for the future has a material impact on people's well-being. So why wouldn't you include that in trying to cultivate a better frame of mind or state of mind for any person, young or old?
Yeah. It has been incredible to see the few friends that I've dragged down the rabbit hole, like see how much more hope that they have in their life, and like how much more, like less anxiety about the future and about like the state of the world they have.
Exactly.
And just the tones of the conversations you have with Bitcoiners are just so much more hopeful and uplifting and focused on sort of like what you can do, what I can do to make my life, my surroundings better. Just last night I was out to dinner with a couple people who were into Bitcoin and a couple people who weren't, and like the mood of the people who weren't into Bitcoin was, it's just like, oh, what's going on in the world? There's like anxiety. Things feel like they're getting worse, and I don't really know what I can possibly do about it. And then all the people into Bitcoin were like, these are the 4 things I'm excited about for the next year. It's going to be awesome. Life is going to get better.
Yeah. They're just like, relax, bro. It's all going to be good. It's all going to be good. Just do a couple of these things and you'll be straight.
Yeah.
But yeah, I agree. And I think that's part of the reason why many of us struggle to maintain like relationship. This might be a bit strongly worded, but just the nature of our interactions with people that are into Bitcoin, whether they happen on podcasts or Bitcoin Twitter, or you have some friends that you talk about it with, you're just so much on the same wavelength that it makes like everything so easy. Like And with
Yeah.
then you go out into the normal world and you're like, holy fuck, like all these crazy opinions and twisted ways of thinking about things and half-ass solutions to big problems, and you're just like, I don't want to
Yeah.
fuck with any of that. Like, I want to focus in on what myself and a growing group of people really believe can be not only a solution for us as individuals, for our happiness and for our well-being, financial and otherwise, but for the broader world also. So
Yeah.
I
It
know what you're
is
saying.
tricky when people like come up to you with problems or sort of anxieties that for Bitcoiners are just either not problems or not problems or not anxieties, and then trying to sort of empathize with that, like anxiety around like, who's going to be the next elected politician,
Right.
or anxiety around, how they'll like whether they should pursue this career they want or shouldn't when money is like really tight, and for Bitcoiners it's just like, stack sats and do what you want and
It sounds so
pursue
simple.
the thing you want.
Yeah, it's so simple. It sounds
stop.
like trivial almost, but it's you're so right. Like when the whole Trump Biden or Republican Democrat divide, that's part of so many conversations these days. It's like, you're playing the wrong game, guys. That shit, that shit doesn't matter.
Yeah, like last night I was talking to somebody who was just kept convincing me, like, you need to pick a side. Pick a side, Reed. Like, what is your life for if you aren't on a side? And I was like,
I am on a side, bro.
Me.
Orange side, baby.
Yeah, my life's for me, for like the people that matter close to me. It's like, I'm not gonna waste my time on like, red versus blue.
Yeah, exactly. It's so silly. But man, it's interesting to talk to you because you're so fresh. Like, you're, coming late 2019. What was the eureka moment for you? Like, what, when did it click, and what was your immediate like kind of behavior afterwards?
So my I got into it like most people and thought Vitalik was a genius, right? Like, I was watching videos of Vitalik on YouTube. And my friend who actually sort of...
But was it just because how he looked, or did you actually understand what he was saying?
No, don't understand anything what he's saying. Like, I'm not a coder.
That guy looks...
I've been in the woods forever, and I like saw him next to Putin and was like, yeah, like that guy is super scrawny, and
he must be a genius.
He must be smart. But my friend actually my friend who's sort of beat me into Bitcoin, the only friend I've had from college that beat me into Bitcoin, started a chain analysis company, actually. And he's in the Bay, and he was coming out to Denver when I was living at the time to go to East Denver. And that was like my first exposure. And he was getting all these cool t-shirts. I was like, oh my God, wow, there's so much energy around ETH. And I was watching videos of Vitalik. Like, this is amazing.
Rainbows,
exactly. But price was totally flat essentially through that whole winter. And it's like I had accumulated a little, but was, like not sure, like most beginners, like not sure which money is going to win, because
right.
there are so many different names, and you look at CoinMarketCap, and they're all on the same list. But then I came out of, I actually went on the Grand Canyon, rafted Grand Canyon, which, side note, greatest raft trip in the world. If you ever get a chance to go, it's amazing.
Oh man, I will for sure. I can't wait.
But came out of that, and the price had just pumped from 4,000 to 5,000, and that pretty much that price move alone made me go 50% in. And then you remember last spring, like, the price came up some more, right. And pretty much just got sucked in deeply from the price moving up. And fortunately,
that was spring 2019. That's what you mean, right?
Yeah.
So you got in winter 18, not winter 19.
No, I got in winter. Like, my first Bitcoin purchases were winter 2019. I'm
Okay,
really new.
so the pump in spring 2019 just made you think like
This
Bitcoin is
is
the one.
exactly.
Right.
And then, well, I was, starting to poke around on Twitter and realizing that seemingly all the smarter people seem to coalesce around Bitcoin. Like, why is that? Like, all these random bot accounts seem to be pumping other things, but like all the legit people seem to on Bitcoin. And then it was really last spring around the height of the pump, and last summer when I just sat down and started reading Rothbard and Mises and Menger and was like, this is this is why it's going to be Bitcoin and not anything else. Um,
And
yeah,
then
but
and then after that,
and after that, I've started writing a newsletter last fall. I essentially thought that that the best use of my time last fall would be to go around and try to convince my whole entire family to buy Bitcoin.
it's okay, bro. It happens to us all at the beginning.
And so I was like honestly planning a road trip. I was like, I'm gonna like they don't really respond to my emails about it, so I'm gonna like go road trip to every single person, like whole extended family, get them to buy Bitcoin. That didn't happen, but I did start a newsletter, and I was writing a newsletter every day to my family.
Wow, holy fuck.
That then started expanding, and now it's just an open newsletter to anyone who wants to join, called Bitcoin Buddha. It's sort of similar to like probably more similar to Rob Sarro's newsletter, but even more focused on beginners, because I feel like I still know that I have these people that are on the newsletter that don't own any yet.
Yeah.
So I'm just
What was the response from two perspectives? One, okay, Reed has just become obsessed with this thing called Bitcoin that we don't think like the only interaction we've ever had with it was like it's drug dealers or it's internet stuff. Like is our son, brother, nephew, whatever, going in fucking insane? And two, like what was their responses to the actual kind of articulation of the logic and reason present in your newsletter? Was there a back and forth with the kind of ideas you were sending over their way?
Yeah. So to answer number two, there was, and that's been really engaging.
Cool.
A couple of sort of like a couple uncles and cousins are interested in investing, and so could have conversations related to the stock market and compare, explain the similarities, the differences between Bitcoin and equities with them, and that's been really rewarding. In terms of the first question, like what do people think now that Reed's obsessed with Bitcoin? I think that like many people who were new or early adopters to Bitcoin, it tends to be people who are like more independent, curious, think for themselves, not willing to accept dominant narratives. And in some ways, maybe slightly more on the eccentric side. And those all line up with my past personality. So I've had a series of other eccentric interests. At one point I was, convinced that I was going to be a monk. I've studied Buddhism for years. I spent a lot of time at meditation retreats, and so I told my parents and my friends that I was, going to be a monastic, and started spending more and more time at a monastery. So they've had these experiences of Reed doing strange things, which in some ways, unfortunately, I think has made them doubt perhaps my Bitcoin
credibility.
Exactly. And I'm like, I'm totally going to be a monk. Like, give me 2 years. I'm going to be a monastic, shave my head. And like 3 years go by. I'm not a monastic. And now I'm telling you the Bitcoin's going to save the world. So like,
you can forgive them for having some trepidation about buying it hook, line, and sinker, right?
Yeah, exactly. But at this point, I just sort of figure that it's like the more touch pieces points you can get them, the better. And it's not going to be me. It's going to be the price that eventually forces them to come to me, and I can just be a good resource for them.
Yeah. What do they think of it all now after several months of, newsletters and letters and discourse about it all? Like what's their stance?
I now probably two or three have now open positions, or I don't think anyone's to the point where they're DCAing.
Right.
But yeah, some of them now, some of them now own it. Other ones are, I think that they are more comfortable with it, but don't like realize it's not for scammers
Right.
per se and
They're just
criminals per
not sure
se. But
about it.
yeah, they're not still not convinced yet. But
I mean,
takes time.
it must lend some credibility to your, your rantings to them that you now work at a Bitcoin company and actual legitimate companies in the
Oh,
space
that's
exist,
yeah.
and they saw fit to have you on board, sort of thing.
Yeah, that's huge. That's huge.
It's funny, man. I feel like a lot of Bitcoiners are in this situation where, and I hate this is kind of like a hokey word that, but it'll serve its purpose here. But like many of us, I think, have been seekers for a lot of our lives. Like we're more curious. We believe that there's something more, whether it's more meaningful or maybe more mysterious or more powerful or more whatever, and that it's out there. And like the 9 to 5 grind, just being a hamster, we just thought that can't be it for a lot of us. And so that led to us probably leading more unconventional lives and espousing more unconventional ideas and opinions than like your average person. And I was totally in the same boat. And it's funny you say that, because in 2008 and 9, in both of those years, I spent about 3 or 4 months in the Amazon learning about ayahuasca shamanism, right? And so at that, that's me. So when I come to the people in my life now and be like, Bitcoin, they're like, yeah, but you're one of those people, and
Yeah.
even though I've always been very methodical, well-read, and articulate when I discuss things that I find meaningful. So like if you want to come at me, like if a family member or friend wanted to come at me and kind of press on my promotion of psychedelics or the benefits of responsibly used psychedelics, if they wanted to like push back on that, I'd be fully ready. I'm ready to not in an argumentative way, but like I'll articulate why I think it's so meaningful, and usually in a fairly convincing way if someone's genuinely interested in listening. But still, I've spent most of my life traveling, exploring, and doing all those things that are a little bit less conventional. So Bitcoin, I think for many people, just falls into the category of like John being John. It's like just another kind of quirky thing, and that may cause them to heed my my advice or my putting this information in front of them less than they would if they heard it on the 8 o'clock news, which is the case with so many people, right? The type of, I think you and I and a lot of other Bitcoiners have the type of credibility that I want, which is the credibility that says, I'm not sure if I'm right, but I'm willing to have the discussion and smash our ideas together and see that, what emerges from that, so I have the humility and the desire to do that. So let's just keep doing that and keep iterating that process so that we can come to a greater approximation of truth. That's the credibility that I seek, and honesty, for all the time. So if someone has a history of being dishonest or seeming dishonest, then they can go fuck themselves. But I think a big portion of the population, they look for that typical mainstream credibility. That guy's wearing a suit and he's on the TV. He must be right or credible or whatever. So, and that's why I think it's great when these big mainstream people come into Bitcoin. Paul Tudor Jones, Wozniak, whenever he said about stuff, like
even Raoul Pal for his, Ethereum shitcoining.
Sure.
Like still that gives a lot of credibility to like my uncle who's an investor who, doesn't understand decentralized systems, but understands macro.
Right. So. Yeah. So with each one of those that comes in, it just gets easier for us to say, okay, don't trust me, but look at that dude, look at that person, look at that person, look at that person. And so and that's just going to accelerate until they're all like, you know what, you motherfuckers were right. And I'll be like, yes, we were.
Yeah. May take 15 years to get all of
them. But I want to circle back to what you were saying, and like this might lead us into what you wanted to discuss. But you said you've been into Buddhism for a while, and you had considered the kind of monastic life. Can you give me the backstory on that, and
yeah,
details?
Absolutely. So I right before I graduated college, I sort of had this realization that my whole life had been spent. I studied science in college, earth science. So my whole life up to that point had been spent sort of studying deductive reasoning, and the scientific method, and that I just had this inkling, partly because I think growing up, I had actually studied Chinese a little bit, been to China once or twice, and had some exposure to Eastern thought. But I had this inkling that like my whole education leading up to college had just been trained in Western thinking, and like I felt like I was missing half the story. And so right after I graduated, sort of started self-studying in Zen and Buddhism. Just found myself drawn into that way of understanding, that sort of holistic way of viewing the world, and started meditating right after I graduated, or senior year, and then just started showing up at meditation retreats and monasteries and just getting sucked into staring at your mind, or really letting go and being in the present moment. So yeah, and that continued through until sort of got more and more and more involved and more interested in monasticism until I was probably 26 or 7. It actually culminated in my, I was dating somebody at the time for maybe 3 or 4 months, and she said, like, what are your long-term plans? And I said, I'm thinking of becoming a monastic, and then she dumped me on the spot. And then that led to that in my mind was this indication of like, you know what, this is right, this is the time for celibacy. And so then I actually like went and spent a year being celibate and spending even more time at monasteries, and after about a year realized that there's some human impulses that I don't think you can meditate away.
Too many boners. I need to get back out in the real world.
And so, still go to meditation retreats, and still meditate, but I don't think that monasticism is my path anymore.
What was the, prior to kind of realizing perhaps the realities of what that life was like, what was the draw or appeal of monastic life versus kind of trying to embody the principles that you seem to derive value from in the Buddhist, like through Buddhism, versus doing that in the real world? So the difference between
good question. And I think that there are a lot of, there are many different sects of Buddhism and many different monasteries you can join. And at least I personally was drawn to Thich Nhat Hanh's tradition, who's sort of a Vietnamese monk who opened a retreat center in France. And I spent some time both in France and then at satellite centers, and they just have a really, really good community. And the people there are really happy, and they smile a lot, and they sing, and they dance, and they meditate. And I think that community, more than anything, drew me in, because you can clearly meditate wherever you can go be a hermit, meditate alone, and sort of look inward exclusively for truth. But it was that community that was really appealing to me. But every time I would go to those communities, I would love it, and have a really great time. But there was something about like some of the random rules that just rubbed me the wrong way. Like 80% of the time I could play along, and then 20% of the time it was like I don't want to.
What would be an example of some of
I don't want to sit and eat in silence. I want to like sit on my swing, like walk around. I don't want to sit around this table with like 10 other people, just stare at my food and eat in silence,
Yeah.
Like I just have too much energy for that.
I always felt like when I was younger, I guess, well, it kind of started in my teenage years. I went to the Himalayas when I was 17 to do a month of trekking and hike up to base camp and tool around in the area. And spent some time in Kathmandu, and I'd always been interested in reading, so I'd go through some of the obscure bookstores in Kathmandu and find books on death and on meditation, on Buddhism, and all this stuff. And I always, I found it very fascinating. I read it all, and like, especially the Eastern faiths, but I'm, yeah, even more receptive to all faiths now for the wisdom that they have, if and without the dogmatic elements. But I think they all have some really timeless wisdom. But the first kind of my first exposure to thinking that way about organized religions was the Eastern faiths, like Buddhism, Zen Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism, which I think is really cool. A bunch of them, Confucian, they all have really some very interesting elements. And but I always thought, like, was that the point, like to seek enlightenment, or if you felt you're inching closer, is it to disengage from the world and just be in this almost like artificial setting where everything is relatively simple and easy and non-chaotic? Or is the real test of the veracity of these principles and how well you've integrated and embodied them the fact that you can take what you believe to be the wisdom that you've derived from them and go out into the chaotic world where there's good and there's evil and there's ambition and there's greed and there's dishonesty and there's all this stuff, and still embody those things, and not just embody them, but use them to or act as kind of a vehicle to express them outwardly in the world, and perhaps like potentiate them. Like and that seemed to me like the more spiritual path, for lack of a better term.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, and I think that's one of the reasons that I was drawn to the particular sect is that it's very outwardly focused. That for a monastery, they pretty much have visitors and guests 9 months out of the year, and they're like running a giant resort retreat center 9 months out of the year, and then 3 months they meditate a little bit more in the winter. But if you go to a lot of other monasteries, very inwardly focused, and I think one of the challenges of that is they don't get a lot of criticism or a lot of people pushing back on their ideas, because they can you'd set up some structure, and then it intensifies as a result of having a small community. It intensifies, and then can end up sort of like going astray, which is why a number of small centers in the American West and Buddhist centers have had sexual abuse allegations, because you just have this build a cult of personality around the Zen monk, and then turns out he's sleeping with the women, and that's much more difficult to happen at the place like Thich Nhat Hanh's monastery, where every day you have people coming in and teaching and joining, and it's feels a lot more like a real world religion, a real world focused sect, compared to many of the other hamlets way off in the mountains that have like six people.
And I can appreciate the differences between those two, but I guess what I'm getting at is like, I feel like it's way easier to convince yourself that you're enlightened or you've attained some sense of peace or presence or whatever, if you're mainly in one setting that's fairly calm, that's fairly orderly. Like if you're stuck in traffic for 4 hours a day, your boss is breathing down your throat for a fucking, something that was due 2 weeks ago. You just broke up with your girlfriend. Your dad is sick in the hospital. Your mom has dementia. Your sisters are just lost their job. And, Trump is president and there's war with Iran. Like if you can, if you can still, maintain or express or integrate a sense of peace through all that, then that to me I think you're less likely to delude yourself into a sense that you've reached or attained some sense of calm in a chaotic world, because the one is like catering the exterior world to facilitate that calm and possibly even, creating the illusion that you've reached it internally. Whereas the other one is absolutely forcing you to find it internally, because you ain't finding it if you just look out in the real world that's happening around you, right?
Yeah. When you talk about sort of like deluding yourself about having found peace or having achieved something, another one of the reasons why I was drawn to this particular sect of Buddhism is they emphasize essentially giving up that as a goal, that like like the goal is to have no goal, essentially. And I think in a lot of other Buddhist sects, essentially they just transfer all the anxieties around career aspirations into spiritual aspirations. So it's like, I'm not making enough money, or then translates into like, I'm not nearly as enlightened enough, I need to work harder, I need to meditate harder.
Right.
you know and I personally, in my spiritual path, feel much more drawn to the realization that the present moment is more than enough, and that there's nothing, if you just look deeply at the present moment, there's nothing wrong with it. And it's only when you get distracted away that you can sort of come up with these ideas and dissatisfactions about what's wrong. And any other layers on top of that, any layer of like, I'm not enlightened enough, is just you adding an unnecessary story on top of the present moment. So you can just drop the story and go back to having a good conversation with John Vallis.
You mentioned one of the things that drew you to this particular sect or setup in France and its satellites around the world was the community. People were smiling, they were happy, they seemed to be well adjusted, that kind of thing. I feel like, I think people come for number go up, for Bitcoin, but a lot of people come into this, they find Bitcoin Twitter, they wind up there and they're like, wait a second, like this is special too, right? This is very special.
And I'm wondering, shit posting.
Yeah. Well, I'm wondering, like, has that been part of what's drawn you further into this as well? Is just seeing like, oh, here's another community of people. They're certainly not claiming to be Buddhists or anything, but they're dancing around this thing that has the potential to do a lot of good for the individual and the world. And they're the type of people that are seeing the world through a similar lens as me and who I want to engage with more. Was that a big part of it for you?
No, Bitcoin Twitter is amazing. I love it. Great community. And I do think that there are, just as I've found really healthy values within the Buddhist community, I've also found really healthy values within the Bitcoin Twitter community. And definitely Bitcoin Twitter can be a little bit more argumentative, much more independent minded. But like the core of what the people are, what they believe in are both really, really healthy.
Yeah. And what do you feel about this? Because I think a lot of people, and of course I'm generalizing, and so there's always going to be disagreement, but I feel like a lot of the nature of the conversations that I have and the behavior that I observe and my own kind of compass is very much concerned with freedom, in all of its different manifestations and avenues and stuff. And if you look at something like Buddhism or a lot of the faiths, at the very, very core, freedom is one of the, it was maybe the fundamental concepts as well. Freedom from suffering, freedom from fear. You could substitute in the word love for that as well. Just kind of a unifying force that kind of negates fear and a lack of freedom. What I'm trying to say? Like, and I wonder if on a fundamental level, that's not what, that's not their most, that's not their biggest similarity in a weird sort of way.
I think it is. I do think it is. And, both Buddhists and Bitcoiners are seeking liberation from something.
Right.
From suffering. And whether you find that, I think you find that both combination of internal work and sort of an external, you have to go out into the world and do the work of liberation. And yeah, I have thought about this a fair amount and seen these similarities, even as Buddhists are talking about the breath and all this peaceful thing, and Bitcoiners are just shit posting on Twitter. I'm like, there's both these people are thinking about freedom in two very different ways.
Or maybe it just seems different. Maybe they're maybe freedom is freedom, and the Bitcoiners are just trying another avenue to get there. And who knows? Maybe they might be more successful in the end. But do you think Bitcoin is becoming a religion?
This is another good question. And I remember like last summer sort of realizing that it was, in talking a little bit with Friar Haas, or just reading some of what he's written, realizing that there
Well,
was
fuck, if
some
you talk to Fryer, you're gonna probably think that it is.
yeah, realizing that there are some dogmatic elements of it, and that those in that in some ways the dogmatic elements of it, like with my experience with Buddhism, those serve a purpose up to a point, and then you need to let go of them, and you need to recognize that it's about freedom and the present moment, and being careful not to cling to the dogmatism of like the unnecessary dogmatism. And I think that at least where I would draw the line, like shitcoins, that's Bitcoin only is necessary dogmatism, but in terms of how you use Bitcoin or what Bitcoin is, to that can't be dogmatic, and that as soon as you start, or you just run into problems if you like are so narrow-minded about like this is the only use case for it and this is exactly how you should use it, that's I think can be religious and unhelpful, but I think that the underlying spirituality of Bitcoin, that's not fit into these boxes, these dogmatic boxes, is really powerful. So,
and by that, do you mean the way that people engage with Bitcoin, what it means to
yeah,
them?
and the guiding principles behind it, that once they get sucked down the rabbit hole, they start to live a life according to ethical principles.
Where do those come from?
Where do the principles come from?
Yeah, like why, once you get sucked down the Bitcoin rabbit hole, do people start espousing certain ethical principles that seem to have a lot of similarity between people?
Yeah, that's a good question. I have no idea. It's strange to see. It's very strange to see because it's just this number on a screen, a node, a wallet. So like, why does it change your ethics? But it does. It really does.
Yeah, it changes your ethics and changes your behavior, or it can. I don't want to say it does for everybody, but it certainly seems to be a common thread for a lot of people. And just back to the point about dogmatism. I'll borrow I think it's a quote from Morpheus. Yes, he said you can't be told what the Matrix is. You have to see it for yourself. And I think that could, like, I always thought with religions, whether they be like the more kind of soft, less dogmatic ones, like your Buddhism and whatever, or your more fundamentalist ones, I always felt like people came to the truth like on their own, like the ancients way back, and then they thought, wow, this is really valuable. This is very beneficial. I would love to share this with people. I would love for people to experience this. What are some like guideposts that I can put down so that people might find this more easily and say, okay, well, try not to do this, don't do this, think this way. And it's like, and I think at the beginning they were like, these are just guidelines, like to help you on your way. This isn't the truth. This just might make the path more clear. And then I think, through co-option and through culture and through everything, that got lost, and the guideposts, the help you on your way stuff got supplanted the real truth. And it became that the real truth is like somehow outside of you, or can't be discerned through and by yourself alone, and you need all this other window dressing. And that's where I think a lot of this went wrong. And that's and as you said, it's a kind of a good parallel with Bitcoin. Like when certain people describe what Bitcoin is and what you should do with Bitcoin, it's like, sure, I take your experience as a form of wisdom and thank you for sharing it, but I'll decide what it is for me, and I'll decide why it's most meaningful for me.
Yeah. I do think that, some people, that those guideposts are useful. Like you can't discount them.
Oh, of course.
They're a tool.
Well, yours was
but
a great
they're not
one.
the only tool.
Bitcoin, not shitcoin, is like something that not, it's not obvious when you come in, but it was a really good guidepost.
Yeah.
And
and so you can't really, get rid of the tools, get rid of the memes, or get rid of the guideposts, but just recognizing that they, they have their time and their place and their use, but they're pointing towards something else. really, and they're
Right.
pointing sort of like inward towards your own understanding, rather than being the embodiment of external truth.
Right. Yeah. Now, maybe this will segue us into the piece you wrote recently and that you wanted to discuss. But because when I asked you, like, is Bitcoin religion? And you said, it seems to have this effect on people's morality. And I asked why, and you're like, well, I don't really know. It's just this digital thing. But I want, obviously its properties is what dictates how we perceive it and how we judge what it can be used for. And somehow our assessment of those things is causing us to change, what it can be used for, and what it will and has the potential to be used for en masse, and the impacts that can have on the world. That's how we're seeing it. And then, almost our own reflection in that is causing some kind of incongruence that we maybe feel we have to correct in order to be more aligned with this thing, which is like a very complex, I'm sure, and an ongoing process. And then I asked you, why do you think that is? And you say, I don't know. But one of the aspects that characterizes Bitcoin is the aspect of scarcity. This is one of the big, not the only, of course, but one of the big aspects that's very unique about Bitcoin. And I wonder, if what the relationship is between that characteristic or property of Bitcoin and what we've been discussing in terms of why people are inspired to see themselves differently and change as a result of that. You wrote a piece on this, and I'm just wondering, kind of what your take on that angle of things was.
I think that scarcity is a fundamental part of Bitcoin, and that it doesn't explain all the changes that you see in people. For instance, I think that people becoming less interested in sort of dualistic politics is probably more a result of the decentralization of Bitcoin, right, and seeing like, oh, this thing works, even though there's no voting. It's an opt-in system. Like, oh, that's cool, that works. Maybe that's how our political system should be run, rather than this two-party system. So not every change, political change in your worldviews, I think, is tied to scarcity of Bitcoin. But that piece that I wrote was about sort of the prevalence of scarcity everywhere, and I actually wrote it as a bit of a response to Robert Breedlove's writing about scarcity, because he's written really beautiful stuff on it, and about Bitcoin scarcity, time, the scarcity of time article. But the tone of those, in some ways, was looking at scarcity as this thing to overcome, or like, the title is The Tyranny of Time Scarcity. And I think that framing of it is just problematic, because then you are just, if you frame scarcity as being this thing to overcome, then you're just fighting reality, because reality is scarce. And I would personally prefer not to. Time on Earth is scarce, and that's not like a tyrannical thing. It's not like an oppression thing. That's just reality. Like, whether I view it as being oppression and tyranny, or I view it as being a uplifting aspect of reality, is up to me. So that piece was about reframing a scarcity to be like a beneficial part of reality, and then seeing it more and more as just a way to, or seeing scarcity more and more helps you get more and more in touch with reality, and just avoid suffering, and avoid like non-truths.
So the piece basically was saying that people say, Bitcoin is absolutely scarce and everything else, or many other things, are infinite. And you were basically making the case that no, everything else is also scarce. It just may be scarce on a scale that one is either irrelevant to us. In the case of like the universe, it's so large that it's effectively scarce for our purposes as a human being, perhaps, but it's not actually. And then you also discuss scarcity in the form of conceptual, or the inner landscape, where when you imagine a cat, was the example you use, you have certain boundaries that help you define in your mind what a cat is. And so you have cat and non-cat. And so at some point there is a boundary of what a cat can
Everything.
be for you, right? For everything. And that's a form of scarcity. And that's the case you were making. Can you elaborate a bit on the last point you were just making there, where you say that an appreciation of the kind of pervasive scarcity that is everywhere can help, can influence how you think about things or yourself in the world? Like, why is it beneficial to understand that scarcity is, is everything? Everything is scarce.
Because it helps you value everything more. If you recognize that each object in your life and each idea in your life has an end to it, then its scarcity gives it meaning and value. And if something is infinite, it's impossible to conceptualize or give value to, both monetary value, but also like personal value to. And the more you can see something as being scarce, the more you're likely to give it both a monetary value and, a non-monetary, a personal value.
But is there, so let's go back to the universal example, right? Because I think you brought it up in your piece, and I think that I don't know, because I'd have to ask the authors, but I assume oftentimes when people refer to like the number of atoms in the universe, for example, I think they may be saying that kind of it's as good as being infinite, because in relative terms the numbers are so staggering as to not influence, or I think air you used as well, because Rothbard talked about air, and it's like if air was more scarce, maybe we would treat it differently and it would be marketed more, be more meaningful to us. But for the things that are so abundant as if to be infinite, at least in terms of our ability to use them, like are so abundant that we're not restricted in any way of our use of those things. Why is it beneficial to still realize that everything is scarce?
Good question. And I'll actually use that Rothbard example and build it out a little bit more. So he wrote that, I think, in 1954, and it was one of his earlier works. Like, it's his most famous work, but he went on to write a lot more and actually develop a lot more ideas after that. And that text that I pulled talked about him thinking that some, I think, universal means are infinite. But later in his career, he wrote about how air, because he used air in 1954. Later in his career, he wrote about how air property rights weren't enforced in the 1880s when factories started producing a lot of smog, and there'd be an apple orchard. Factory smog would flow into the apple orchard. The apple orchard would sue the factory in court, and the courts ruled against the property rights of the apple orchards. And he sort of like rips into the courts, and highlights that as being a part of the decline of protection of property rights in the United States. So in that example that he wrote about later in his life, air clearly is scarce and valued. Like, if you have an apple orchard, the air around you is scarce. And so, like, if you look at air the way Rothbard did in 1954, it's infinite. It doesn't matter until those situations arise when it becomes clear, like a factory opening up right next to an apple orchard, that it is not infinite. And then you do need to make a decision about whether to enforce those property rights or not enforce those property rights. And I just think that the more that we can move from 1954 Rothbard saying air is infinite toward air isn't infinite, air should have property rights, like literally enforce the property rights of air over your property, the better we'll be.
Okay. And what do you think is the significance of a thing like Bitcoin, which presumes to have absolute scarcity, and perhaps the first external instantiation of that we can, that we can behold?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and I'm gonna take actually issue with the framing, whereas I don't think it's the first example of absolute scarcity. Everything is absolutely scarce. What's different about Bitcoin is that it's the first example where we can easily conceptualize that through time, we can trust that its scarcity is set, that we're not going to discover more of this thing or make more of this resource accessible in ways that it was just difficult to conceptualize, like the end to how much dollars you can print, or
so
the end to how much gold that you can make.
Right. So you're taking issue with the fact that scarcity is zero sum. It's one or the other, right?
Yeah, it's
and
binary.
So everything is absolutely scarce. It's just, again, it's how much will we discover
that.
Yeah.
And how much you can see that, and how much you can trust that a certain amount is actually the amount.
Right.
So like we can't we don't really know how much gold is in the universe, but it is scarce. And so because we don't know for a fact how much it is, it's difficult to value that. It's difficult to like wrap our head around it and really use that as much, or compared to Bitcoin, where you know exactly how much there is.
Right.
Like both are scarce. One is unknown in the exact amount. The other is perfectly known. And it's much easier to build a functioning economy around something that's perfectly known than around these massive unknowns of scarcity.
Okay. So that's why that's why the nature of Bitcoin's scarcity is valuable and important.
Yeah, it's more like a temporal a trust that people can have in the network through time, compared to, Bitcoin is absolutely scarce, gold isn't. It's like trusting it through time. I think that for me is the important part, or the distinguishing part about Bitcoin versus other things.
Mm-hmm. What else is taking up a lot of your mental real estate these days on this sort of line of thinking with Buddhism and Bitcoin and these sort of topics?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I think as a result of thinking about scarcity differently than Breedlove or Knut thinks about it, is just like reframing it not as the absolute, and Bitcoin not as the absolute invention of scarcity, or not as like a singularity, and the absolute scarcity can only be invented once. Like I think that's a useful, catchy meme for why altcoins don't work, but I don't think that's true, because I sort of started thinking about, like, okay, imagine that we come in contact with aliens who have been running a proof of work network for 1 billion years with 1 trillion times as much hash rate, and that's connected to 1,000 other trading partners. Like they have a way bigger, absolutely scarce, way more secure network. Like which one? Like first of all, that's possible, and second of all, because that hypothetical is possible, that suggests, Bitcoin isn't this absolute invention of scarcity. It's the first one the first like scarce money we've developed, but it's not the first one that could exist. It's the first one we know about. And then secondly, like playing that forward with like what would end up happening to Bitcoin if we discovered, turns out, alien coin that has way higher, a longer history, all the great properties of Bitcoin, but just longer, stronger, more trading partners and more wealth, historical wealth, and more decentralized. Like, which one would win? And sort of realizing that Bitcoin is powerful because it's the best thing we have right now. But in that situation, actually, alien coin, Bitcoin 100x, with 1,000 more years of hash power and decentralization, that would be the protocol that we would be forced into using, because we want all this sweet alien technology that we could trade alien coin for.
Right.
And so, yeah.
No, I'm with you.
I'm thinking actually about. I've been thinking about writing an article about this, and I hesitate to do it because because I don't want to be like labeled a shit corner for like proposing this thing.
Fuck
Because
that. No,
I
fuck that.
don't
That's
think
interesting. It's an
I
interesting line
don't
of
think that
thought.
it's possible for any human cause cryptocurrency to overtake Bitcoin. But it is possible that Bitcoin is actually just behind the time, and we just haven't been exposed to a monetary network yet that is far bigger, far stronger, and far vaster. So it's the best thing we have, and we need to use it. But on exposure, say to Alien Coin, I don't think Bitcoin wins.
So
If Alien Coin's properties are, you know, stronger.
yeah. So how about this? Instead of the first example of absolute scarcity, whether as an innovation or an evolution or whatever, is it more appropriate to talk about Bitcoin as the kind of first time scarcity has come under the control or influence of humans? Is that a more accurate way of looking at this? You know, because scarcity has been outside of our control forever, right? Like, because as you say, you know,
Yeah.
it's not something that we could ever enforce.
Yeah.
And this is the first time that humans have created scarcity, are able to enforce genuine scarcity.
Yeah.
You know, it's kind of
I think that's true.
It seems like a
It's not
very
as catchy of a meme though, you know. Like way better on a Twitter post to be like absolute scarcity, first time ever. It's like that's like a lot of nuance, you know.
It is a bit of nuance, but I mean, it needs refining. It's the first time I've ever thought about it, you know. But I think we could do something catchier with it. But it very much the sense I'm getting after just thinking and saying that is like it's a very much stealing fire from the gods sort of dynamic, I feel, because this kind of universal truth of scarcity that existed, you know, that was untouchable for all of time as far as we know, we've now brought a piece of it under our control, and we can use that power now, that truth, for our own ends. And that's a pretty amazing sort of thing. And I think all the other stuff still stands, where it may be the case that we can bring that down under our control, and we have done so, but it doesn't work if we try to bring it down under our control in a million different ways. Like then it might slip through our fingers if we treat it that way. Like maybe we still can only have it once, i.e. in Bitcoin, and not a billion other blockchains or shit coins or other substances.
Yeah. I think that's a compelling argument. I don't think that's I don't think that that's true.
So I guess this is the question, and then you can respond. But can we only enforce? Can humans only enforce scarcity in one instantiation?
So again, I don't think that's true, because I don't think that you can make more Bitcoin Cash, for instance. Like that also is absolutely scarce. It's just useless, right? So it's like
well, you could make more. But this is my point, right? You could make more if you change the consensus rules, right?
Yeah.
So like what I'm saying is do we have to kind of as a human collective agree that we've been able to distill down this control over scarcity, but you know it's going to take all of our cooperation to maintain it, because it's going to require us not to lose control of it. It's going to require of us not to change the thing that's allowed us to establish our influence over it in the first place. You're right, from a protocol level, consensus rules as it exists right now, that you can't no more Bitcoin Cash should be created. But if enough people got together and was like, let's make a billion more, then they could. So like that's kind of what I mean.
Yeah. I think that the money, the strongest money, will coalesce around one, and that you can create, like you can continue to fork Bitcoin Cash and Bitcoin to make more, and in that sense it's not infinite, or in that sense, you can make more of them, and the Bitcoin Cash isn't scarce, but still the people running Bitcoin Cash, that's still scarce. So I just don't don't think that that scarcity alone can explain why Bitcoin is the
all right, let me try one more time, and I'm doing this because this is all coming up on the fly. Like I've literally never thought about it in this way before. But if we accept that it's not that we've discovered absolute scarcity, but the real innovation here is that we've gained control over the enforcement of scarcity for the first time. And so is it our enforcement of scarcity under our control? Is our enforcement of our control over scarcity what we need to maintain in order to keep our control over scarcity? Like hold on, let me see if I can do better with this. It may be the case that the only reason we have the only reason why we have scarcity we have scarcity under our control so long as we can enforce it. And if we cannot enforce it, then we no longer have it. And in all other examples like Bitcoin Cash, it cannot be enforced. The question remains, can it be maintained and enforced with Bitcoin? There are threat models to Bitcoin, right? There are ways in which that scarcity may be able to be stopped being enforced and then we lose it. But Bitcoin is our greatest shot at maintaining our enforcement over scarcity. How about that?
Yeah, I do think Bitcoin is the best shot at money and best shot at maintaining enforcement over scarcity, or maintaining an agreement, a collective agreement to abide by scarcity, and to see it and to, yeah.
Do we have the capacity as a species to do that for more than one thing? To enforce, I mean, look, we may really be stealing fire from the gods here. And are we able to do it more than once, or is it going to require all of our collective will to just enforce our control over one instantiation of scarcity? Because it's such a monumental thing to be able to do it at all in the first place.
Yeah. You're getting heady. And it's also tricky because you're framing things in terms of like us and our and collective, and that's like giving me the like communist heebie-jeebies,
Well, no, I mean that this is we're all, if it was just me and Bitcoin, it's not a thing, right? Like that, yeah, the consensus rules are held up by the user. That's what I mean by the we and the collective.
Yeah. Yeah. But I don't know if like we are really enforcing it. We're just coalescing around this thing, and maybe.
Well, you're enforcing it by enforcing the consensus rules, by abiding by the consensus rules and choosing to do so, right?
Yeah.
You don't need to have an answer. I'm just, I'm wondering what if you got any thoughts.
I think I need to write an essay about alien coin. Think about this some more. Like write an essay detailing threat models to Bitcoin. Aliens attack. Number one, everything else.
Maybe the galactic. Maybe the universal trade networks are just about trading each civilization's enforcement of the scarcity that they've.
No, that would never.
But they've been able to.
That would not happen. Like you would move towards one money. You would always move towards one money. Whoever has the biggest, baddest money, everyone is going to be forced to use that.
Probably. I need to think about this more too.
Because I've thought about this. Like I was like, oh man, it's gonna be great if aliens show up as Bitcoiners. Like, yeah, we've got the second best money, but really, what I'm gonna want is like the sweet alien technology, and the aliens are not gonna want my Bitcoin because they have all their trading partners using this. Also, absolutely.
Well, there's a lot wrapped up in this, right? It's almost like the fiat thing today. Like, if you want to access, Burma's market, and notwithstanding that they'll take US dollars, but what I'm saying is like, if a given market is used to transacting in something, then to trade with them, usually you're going to need their currency to transact. So
You're right.
You know,
You're right.
It could be something like that.
Maybe Menger is wrong, and that we could end up if two things are absolutely scarce. You know.
All right, I think we're just
Anyway.
we're just gonna end up blowing our own minds here. So we'll have to think about this more. Anything else that you wanted to talk about before we shut this thing down today?
No, thank you for having me on, letting me tell my stories about rapping with kids in the woods, and,
I love it.
And scarcity, and alien coin.
Exactly what I expected out of this conversation.
I appreciate.
Well, man, yeah, I really enjoyed this too. This was super fun. I'm sure we'll do it again. Did you want to direct people anywhere before we say goodbye?
Oh yeah. Follow me at Reed Womack or at Reed Womack on Twitter. Follow Swan Bitcoin. Start stacking your DCA, stacking sats with us. Yeah.
That's it. Well, dude, it's been my pleasure, and like I said, I'm sure we'll talk again in the future. Until then, be well, brother.
Absolutely.